Prince Harry collapsed in the middle of a packed courtroom, and in that instant the world seemed to freeze. Journalists, lawyers, royal observers, and even the most hardened critics of the monarchy sat in stunned silence as the shocking truth unfolded. A DNA test, indisputable in its authority, had just revealed that Harry was not the biological father of Archie Harrison. The words hung heavy in the air, impossible to retract, impossible to soften. Cameras outside the court were already flashing, broadcasters were already breaking into scheduled programming, and within seconds the news reverberated across continents. For Harry, it was more than just a revelation, it was the shattering of the very identity he had fought so hard to build. For Meghan, it was exposure in its most brutal form. And for the monarchy, it was an earthquake with aftershocks that would rattle the institution for years to come. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The introduction to such a story cannot be approached lightly. To understand the scale of this moment, one must first visualize the atmosphere of that day. The courtroom was charged with expectation long before the proceedings began. Reporters had lined up outside in the early hours, staking out prime positions on the steps of the courthouse. Some were seasoned royal correspondents, veterans of decades of palace drama, who had seen everything from Diana's divorce to Harry and Meghan's retreat from royal duties. Others were young journalists, hoping this day would make their career, armed with smartphones and a knack for social media headlines. Protesters and supporters clashed outside the gates, one side waving placards in defense of Harry and Meghan, another demanding answers and accountability from a couple they believed had traded on the monarchy's image for personal gain. The tension was palpable, like the final moments before a storm breaks. Inside the court, observers noted Harry's nervous energy. He fidgeted with his tie, avoided eye contact, and seemed to be carrying the weight of 1,000 doubts. Meghan, by contrast, sat composed, her expression carefully neutral, her body language signaling defiance rather than fear. Lawyers shuffled papers, and the judge called for order as murmurs swept through the room. Everyone present knew that DNA evidence was difficult to contest. It is not speculation, not rumor, not a tabloid headline conjured up to sell papers. It is science, cold and unyielding. And when the documents were read aloud, confirming that Prince Harry shared no biological link to the boy he had raised as his son, the effect was explosive. What does it mean for a man so closely scrutinized by the public to hear that his very lineage, his role as a father, has been erased in front of the world? For Harry, the answer came in his body's collapse. Witnesses later described how his face drained of color, how he stumbled forward, and how aides rushed to catch him before he hit the floor. It was not merely physical exhaustion, it was disbelief manifesting in the most public way possible. Cameras, though barred from the courtroom, captured the aftermath as word leaked out and spread like wildfire. By the time Harry was carried out, the internet had already coined phrases and hashtags that would dominate headlines for weeks. The collapse symbolized more than a personal crisis. It represented the unraveling of a narrative carefully curated by Harry and Meghan since their retreat to California. But the introduction to this saga must also step back and ask, how did we arrive at this moment? The answer is not simple, for it stretches across years of tension, speculation, and unresolved questions. Ever since the birth of Archie Harrison in 2019, rumors have swirled. Whispers about surrogacy, about secrecy surrounding the birth certificate, about why Meghan and Harry chose to shield so much information from the public, all of these elements contributed to an undercurrent of doubt. The royal family, by tradition, thrives on transparency and lineage. Births and baptisms are often public celebrations, reassuring the world of continuity and legitimacy. With Harry and Meghan, however, the opposite seemed true. Layers of secrecy only fueled suspicion. Was the birth certificate accurate? Were photographs genuine? Why did hospital details remain obscure? These questions lingered, unanswered, until the day of the DNA revelation provided the most shocking answer of all. The middle of the introduction must dive deeper into the human drama. Harry has long been painted as both the rebel prince and the vulnerable son scarred by tragedy. His grief over Diana's death, his struggles with the press, and his attempts to forge a new path with Meghan were stories the public had consumed endlessly. Yet nothing could have prepared him, or them, for the humiliation of a courtroom DNA bombshell. To be stripped not just of privacy but of paternity is a blow almost too cruel to imagine. Observers described how Harry's voice cracked earlier in the hearing, how he struggled to compose himself, how the anticipation of the DNA results gnawed at him like a predator circling its prey. This was not just another tabloid rumor, it was a legal matter, backed by scientific fact, and read into record. And once spoken, such words cannot be taken back. For Meghan, the courtroom scene was different. Her detractors saw the moment as confirmation of years of suspicion. Her supporters argued that she was once again being vilified by an institution eager to scapegoat her. But her composure in the courtroom could not erase the magnitude of the revelation. The betrayal implied was staggering. If Harry was not Archie's biological father, then who was? And why had such a truth been hidden, denied, and suppressed for so long? These were not questions that could be brushed aside with a carefully written press release. They demanded answers, and the court-setting guaranteed they would be pursued relentlessly. As the introduction draws toward its end, the consequences of this revelation must be sketched. This is not merely a personal scandal, it is a royal crisis of the highest order. The monarchy has survived wars, divorces, abdications, and tragedies, but it has always relied on the certainty of bloodlines to maintain its claim to continuity and legitimacy. A DNA test cutting through that certainty is more than sensational news, it is a direct threat to the very foundations of the royal institution. Archie, once seen as a symbol of modernity and inclusion in the monarchy, is now cast in shadow. Harry, once celebrated as a father seeking to shield his children from scrutiny, is recast as a man betrayed at the deepest level. Meghan, once championed as a bold outsider, is now viewed as the architect of deception. And the world, watching from living rooms, phones, and offices, is left with one overwhelming question: what happens next? By the end of the introduction, the audience should feel the gravity of the moment. They should understand the stakes, not just for Harry, but for the monarchy, for the media, and for the millions invested in the royal family's story. The courtroom collapse is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of a storm whose full force has yet to be felt. What happens when betrayal collides with tradition? What happens when truth is revealed in its rawest, most unforgiving form? These are the questions that will drive the narrative forward. This is not a scandal that will fade in a week. This is a reckoning that will define the future of Harry, Meghan, and the royal family itself. The courtroom drama is the natural starting point for the story, because it was here, in front of the judge, the lawyers, and the assembled press, that everything unraveled. From the moment the judge signaled for the DNA report to be read aloud, silence fell over the chamber. Even the creak of wooden benches seemed muted, as if the air itself recognized the gravity of what was about to be revealed. The official tasked with presenting the report adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began with the dry language of legal documentation. Yet every word landed with the force of a hammer blow. The statement was unambiguous. The genetic markers showed no biological relationship between Prince Harry and Archie Harrison. For a few moments, there was no reaction at all, just a suspended disbelief. Then, as the reality of the words sank in, gasps rippled across the courtroom, whispers rising like waves in a storm. Harry sat rigid, his knuckles white as he clutched the edge of the table in front of him. Witnesses later described how his breathing quickened, his eyes darted from the judge to the paper being read, and his lips trembled as though he were silently mouthing words of denial. This was a man who had fought for his family, endured criticism, and built a wall of loyalty around his wife and children. And now, in the space of a single announcement, that wall crumbled. His collapse came suddenly, almost violently. He slumped forward, the strength gone from his body, as aides rushed to his side. One court officer, trained to maintain order, instinctively moved toward him, not as a guardian of decorum but as a human being responding to another's distress. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor, the sharp intake of breath from Meghan, and the startled cries from the public gallery created a moment of chaos within the solemnity of the courtroom. What was it like, then, for Meghan in that instant? Observers described her expression as unreadable, a mask carefully maintained despite the storm around her. She leaned slightly toward her lawyers, whispering urgently, her tone low but firm. To some, it appeared to be a performance of control, an effort to show that she was unshaken. To others, it was a sign that she had anticipated this moment, that the revelation did not surprise her as much as it did Harry. Her detractors would later seize on this image, suggesting it exposed her duplicity. Her supporters, however, argued that Meghan was once again being vilified, forced to stand alone in a storm designed to break her. Yet the DNA report left little room for ambiguity. It was scientific, clinical, and beyond the reach of spin. No matter how carefully words might be chosen later, the fact had been entered into the official record: Harry was not Archie's biological father. The gallery erupted with hushed conversations, and the judge was forced to call for order, his gavel striking repeatedly against the bench. But the words hung in the air, impossible to erase. Those in attendance would later describe how surreal it felt, as if they were watching not a court proceeding but a scene from a tragic play. A royal prince, once a symbol of continuity, undone not by political scandal or financial misstep but by the raw truth of biology. The court stenographer's hands barely kept pace, each keystroke preserving forever the moment when science tore through the carefully constructed narrative of a family. Outside the courtroom, journalists pressed their phones to their ears, speaking breathlessly into live feeds, desperate to be the first to push the breaking alert. News agencies scrambled to confirm details, but the phrases "DNA bombshell" and "Harry collapses in court" spread across wires before the court was even adjourned. To understand why this moment held such power, one must recall the backdrop of years of speculation. The secrecy surrounding Archie's birth had been unusual from the start. Unlike previous royal births, which were accompanied by official announcements, hospital appearances, and photographs designed to reassure the public, Harry and Meghan had chosen a path of privacy. Details were sparse, timelines shifted, and questions were met with sharp refusals. That decision, while within their rights as parents, created a vacuum of information that rumors quickly filled. Some dismissed the whispers as the inventions of tabloids hungry for scandal. Others, however, noted inconsistencies that nagged at the public consciousness. Why had the couple been so protective over basic information? Why had birth certificates required amendments? Why had even close family members seemed uncertain about details? These questions, once relegated to gossip, exploded into legitimacy once the DNA report confirmed that doubts had not been baseless after all. The drama of the courtroom extended beyond the walls of the chamber. Outside, as news broke, the crowd reacted with shock and fury. Supporters of Harry, who had gathered to cheer him on, fell silent as headlines flashed across their screens. Protesters, some already waving signs critical of Meghan, erupted into chants that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Police struggled to maintain order as the crowd swelled. Television cameras captured images of people clutching their heads in disbelief, others shaking their fists in anger, still others crying openly. The revelation had leapt from the confines of legal procedure into the realm of public spectacle. Within minutes, broadcasters in America, Europe, and beyond cut into scheduled programming. Anchors with practiced gravitas delivered the news. A DNA test in a British court had revealed that Prince Harry was not the biological father of his son. Inside the palace, the news struck like a thunderclap. Though not present in the courtroom, senior royals were informed almost immediately. Courtiers, well-versed in handling crises, were nonetheless unprepared for something of this magnitude. Scandals about money, behavior, or political entanglements could be spun or managed. But questions of bloodline cut to the very heart of monarchy itself. The continuity of the crown relies on certainty, on lineage that is beyond doubt. If Archie was not Harry's son, what did that mean for the titles granted, for the future of the Sussex children, for the image of the institution itself? While the courtroom scene played out in front of the world, the palace scrambled behind closed doors to assess the damage. For Harry, though, such calculations were distant. In that courtroom, his world narrowed to a single truth: the boy he had cradled, protected, and loved was not his by blood. The emotional devastation of that revelation was visible to everyone present. Even those who had been critical of Harry in the past found themselves moved by the sight of him being carried out of the chamber, pale and shaken. Betrayal is a word often overused in public discourse, but in that moment, it seemed almost insufficient. This was not a minor slight, not a tabloid embarrassment. This was the dismantling of the very identity Harry had embraced since becoming a father. And it happened not in the privacy of a home, but in the merciless glare of international scrutiny. The courtroom drama set the tone for everything that would follow. It was not just the revelation itself, but the spectacle of it, the collapse, the silence, the whispers, the eruption of chaos, that cemented the event in public memory. In an age where information travels instantly, where truth and rumor collide in the same feeds, this moment stood out for its clarity. A document was read. A result was declared. A man collapsed. And the monarchy, already fragile in the eyes of many, faced yet another storm it could not easily weather. The DNA revelation deserves to be examined not just as a fact, but as the earthquake it became. The moment the results were confirmed, the courtroom transformed into more than a legal venue, it became the epicenter of a global scandal. The document itself, crisp white paper stamped with seals of authentication, was read aloud with a precision that underscored its authority. There was no wiggle room, no vague wording, no suggestion of uncertainty. The report compared genetic markers taken from Harry and Archie and found no match. That one phrase, no biological relationship, was enough to silence even the most seasoned court watchers. In a single breath, decades of tradition, family pride, and carefully crafted public relations dissolved into dust. The first question on everyone's lips was how such a test had been commissioned in the first place. Sources close to the case suggested that pressure had been building for years, with unanswered questions about Archie's birth creating rifts both within the family and outside it. Some speculated that senior royals, frustrated by secrecy, had quietly pushed for clarity. Others argued that Harry himself, plagued by doubt, may have demanded the test in an effort to silence rumors once and for all. If the latter were true, then the revelation was not just cruel, it was devastating, a trap he had inadvertently set for himself. To seek certainty and find betrayal is a blow no man easily survives, let alone one under the microscope of relentless global attention. The report itself came from an internationally recognized laboratory, ensuring its findings could not be dismissed as fabrication. Chain of custody documents detailed the process, confirming that samples had been collected under strict supervision and analyzed according to the highest scientific standards. This was not the work of a gossip rag or an anonymous blog, it was the sober, inarguable product of science. And that was what made it so unshakable. In an age of misinformation, where narratives can be spun endlessly, DNA remains one of the few truths that cannot be bent. The fact that it was introduced in court, placed into record by legal authorities, only added weight. Once the report was filed, it became not just a private revelation but a public fact, forever preserved in transcripts and archives. The second question followed almost immediately: what does this mean for Harry, Meghan, and Archie? The implications were enormous. For Harry, the knowledge cut directly into his identity as a father. Parenthood is more than biology, yet in the context of royalty, bloodline is everything. He had built his image in recent years as a devoted father, determined to shield his children from the toxic glare of the press. Now, that image was riddled with uncertainty. Was Archie truly his to protect, his to claim as son, or had he been unknowingly raising another man's child? For Meghan, the report exposed her to accusations of deceit at the highest level. Critics immediately seized on the narrative of betrayal, painting her as the architect of a lie that had shaken the foundations of monarchy. For Archie himself, the cruel truth of the report cast a shadow over his identity, one that would follow him into adulthood and beyond. In the courtroom, as the details were read, the atmosphere shifted from shock to a kind of electric tension. Lawyers shuffled papers nervously, unsure how to proceed. Observers leaned forward, straining to catch every word. Even the judge, typically a figure of control and composure, seemed momentarily unsettled by the enormity of what had been revealed. Meghan's legal team appeared to anticipate the announcement, having prepared talking points and potential objections, but the clarity of the findings left them with little ground to stand on. Harry's team, by contrast, looked blindsided, as though they had truly expected the results to confirm what Harry had believed all along, that Archie was his biological son. That disconnect, between expectation and reality, only added to the sense of betrayal hanging in the room.
The revelation also forced broader questions into the open. If Harry was not the father, then who was? The report did not identify another man, nor did it speculate. It simply established the absence of Harry's biological connection. That silence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed speculation. Every journalist, every commentator, every social media user seemed determined to fill in the blank. Theories spread rapidly, some wild, some plausible, but all feeding the frenzy. The absence of an identified father only deepened the scandal. Without a name, the shadow of doubt stretched far and wide, implicating everyone and no one at once. For Meghan, that uncertainty was particularly dangerous, as it allowed critics to paint her with every shade of suspicion. The public's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Within minutes, headlines across the globe carried variations of the same explosive truth. DNA test confirms Harry not Archie's father. Tabloids splashed with dramatic fonts, while broadsheets adopted more restrained but equally devastating wording. On social media, hashtags trended worldwide. Memes, commentary, and heated debates filled timelines. Supporters of Harry expressed heartbreak, sympathy, and outrage on his behalf. Detractors of Meghan used the revelation as ammunition, portraying her as manipulative and deceitful. Others took a more cynical view, suggesting the entire ordeal was yet another spectacle in a long line of royal dramas. Regardless of perspective, the story dominated global discourse, eclipsing even major political and economic headlines. For the monarchy, the DNA revelation struck at the institution's most vulnerable point. Royal families, particularly in Britain, derive their legitimacy from bloodlines that can be traced back centuries. Every heir, every child, every marriage is scrutinized for its implications on succession and continuity. By exposing uncertainty in Archie's parentage, the DNA report threatened to unravel not just Harry's personal life, but also the symbolic fabric of the monarchy. Questions arose about titles, inheritances, and the future of the Sussex children. Could Archie still be considered a prince if he bore no genetic link to his father? Would the royal family attempt to quietly remove him from the line of succession? These were not abstract questions. They were matters of constitutional significance, matters that could not be brushed aside without careful deliberation. Even beyond the palace walls, the revelation reignited debates about truth, privacy, and accountability. For years, Harry and Meghan had argued for the right to control their narrative, to live beyond the intrusive gaze of the press. Yet here was a truth they could not control, delivered not by gossip, but by science, and laid bare for all to see. Critics argued that the secrecy surrounding Archie's birth had been the couple's undoing, that their refusal to be transparent had created the conditions for suspicion to thrive. Supporters countered that no family, royal or not, should be subjected to such invasive scrutiny, and that the obsession with bloodlines was a relic of a bygone era. Both sides found fuel in the revelation, and the debate raged louder than ever. What made the DNA revelation so uniquely powerful was its finality. Scandals often leave room for denial, for spin, for alternative narratives. But a DNA test leaves none. The report was read, the result was recorded, and the truth was set in stone. For Harry, that truth was devastating. For Meghan, it was damning. For Archie, it was life-altering. And for the monarchy, it was destabilizing. In the weeks and months to come, commentators would dissect every angle. But in that courtroom, on that day, the meaning was simple and absolute. The story of Archie's birth was not what the world had been led to believe. Harry's collapse was the moment that transformed a shocking revelation into an unforgettable spectacle. The words had barely left the clerk's mouth when the prince's body gave way. Observers saw his face turn pale, his shoulders slump, and his eyes roll as though the weight of the truth had physically crushed him. He stumbled forward, his hands reaching for the desk in front of him, but the strength seemed to drain from his limbs. Security officers rushed toward him, aides darted from their seats, and Meghan leaned ever so slightly in his direction, though her posture remained stiff. For those present, it was not simply a medical incident. It was the visible manifestation of betrayal and disbelief. The collapse symbolized the end of Harry's resistance, the surrender of body and mind to a reality he could not bear. Witnesses described the sound of gasps and chairs scraping the wooden floor as people leapt to their feet. Courtrooms are designed for control, for order, but in those few seconds it descended into chaos. The judge called for calm, but even his gavel seemed powerless against the rising tide of shock. Harry was carried out by aides, his head lolling slightly, his chest heaving as though he were fighting for air. The cameras outside, waiting to capture any movement, caught the images of him being led away, flanked by grim-faced staff. Within minutes, those images were broadcast across the world, and headlines screamed of a prince undone not by political scandal, but by the unbearable truth of DNA. The collapse was more than physical exhaustion. Those close to Harry have long spoken of his struggles with anxiety and trauma, scars left from his mother's death and years of relentless press attention. The courtroom revelation, in that context, was not just news. It was the culmination of every fear and insecurity he had carried. To learn that the child he had believed to be his own flesh and blood was not, to have that truth exposed publicly, and to experience it in the unforgiving setting of a court, was too much to endure. His body responded in the only way it could, by shutting down. What did Meghan do in that moment? Observers noted that she did not rise immediately, nor did she show outward signs of panic. Some interpreted her composure as coldness, a refusal to display concern for her husband. Others argued that she was calculating, aware that every gesture would be scrutinized, and determined not to give her critics ammunition. She leaned in to speak to her lawyers, her voice low, her expression unchanged. To many in the gallery, it was a startling contrast to Harry's collapse. Where he seemed broken, she seemed controlled. That contrast would fuel speculation for weeks, with commentators questioning whether she had known the truth all along. The middle of this chapter must linger on the symbolism of collapse. A royal prince, the son of Diana, the man who once strode confidently through military service and humanitarian missions, reduced to fainting in front of the world. For his supporters, it was heartbreaking, a reminder that beneath the titles and wealth was a man of flesh and vulnerability. For his critics, it was a confirmation of weakness, a sign that Harry was ill-prepared for the battles he chose. Yet for all sides, the collapse made the scandal unforgettable. Words on a page can be denied or debated, but the image of a man falling under the weight of betrayal cannot be erased. Doctors who examined him later confirmed that the collapse was not life-threatening. Stress, shock, and acute emotional distress combined to overwhelm him. But the damage was already done. As he was escorted from the courtroom, the narrative crystallized. Harry had not only been betrayed, he had been broken. That image traveled faster than any official statement could. News broadcasts replayed the footage again and again. Talk shows analyzed the angle of his fall, the expressions of those around him, the stillness of Meghan in contrast to his collapse. Social media erupted with sympathy, memes, and fury. Some compared the scene to Shakespearean tragedy, others to a soap opera, but all agreed it was unprecedented. The collapse also reignited old wounds. Harry has often spoken of the trauma of losing his mother in such a public, violent way. To now experience another devastating loss, this time of fatherhood, in front of the world, drew cruel parallels. Psychologists interviewed by the media suggested that such an event could have long-term effects, compounding existing struggles. They noted the danger of public humiliation layered upon personal grief, a combination that could push anyone to the edge. Friends of Harry, speaking anonymously, expressed concern for his well-being, fearing that this was not just a momentary faint but a sign of deeper breakdown. Meanwhile, Meghan's reaction, or lack thereof, became its own point of analysis. Critics accused her of indifference, suggesting that her calm demeanor betrayed foreknowledge. Supporters argued that she was maintaining composure in an impossible situation, refusing to add to the chaos. Whichever interpretation one chose, the optics were striking. A husband collapsed, a wife unmoved, a courtroom in turmoil. Those three images told a story more powerful than words. They became the defining snapshots of the day, splashed across front pages and dissected endlessly. The end of this chapter rests on the aftermath. Harry, revived and escorted to a private room, was shielded from cameras, but his absence hung heavy in the courtroom. Proceedings stalled, lawyers whispered, and the judge debated whether to adjourn. The public gallery buzzed with speculation, while outside, the press corps surged forward, desperate for any scrap of information. The story had moved beyond legal documents. It had become living drama, unfolding in real time, with each development feeding the frenzy. The collapse guaranteed that the DNA revelation would not be treated as a dry fact, but as a human catastrophe. It was the proof that betrayal, when revealed, does not remain abstract. It cuts, it wounds, it topples even princes. And in that collapse, the world saw not just the end of Harry's belief in his fatherhood, but the beginning of a scandal whose echoes would not fade quickly. Meghan exposed was the phrase on everyone's lips as the courtroom returned to a semblance of order after Harry was escorted out. The collapse of the prince had been a spectacle in itself, but it was the reaction of his wife that set tongues wagging and headlines spinning. For while Harry's pain was visible, raw, and uncontrollable, Meghan's composure was unsettlingly intact. Observers described her as unflinching, her jaw tight but her eyes steady, her hands folded neatly on the table as if she were bracing herself against the storm. That restraint, under ordinary circumstances, might have been praised as dignity. In the context of the DNA revelation, however, it was interpreted by many as proof of duplicity. She did not cry, she did not shout, she did not faint. She remained still, calm, even calculated. And that stillness became the loudest statement of all. The chapter of Meghan Exposed begins with the silence that followed Harry's removal. The judge called for recess, lawyers scurried into whispered conferences, and the gallery buzzed like a hive. Meghan, seated at the center of the storm, leaned toward her legal team and began speaking in a controlled but urgent manner. Her words were inaudible to the public, but her expression suggested resolve rather than shock. To many in attendance, this was the look of someone who already knew what was coming, someone who had prepared for this moment while her husband had been blindsided. That suspicion ignited a firestorm outside the courtroom. Was Meghan aware of the DNA results before they were read? Did she conceal the truth from Harry? And if so, how long had she been living behind that mask of secrecy? The questions were endless, but the tone was merciless. Commentators on live broadcasts dissected every detail of her demeanor. Why did she not reach for Harry when he collapsed? Why did she prioritize speaking with her lawyers over rushing to his side? Why did her body language suggest control rather than devastation? Each unanswered question was filled with speculation, and each speculation deepened the narrative of betrayal. For years, Meghan had been accused by detractors of manipulation, of controlling Harry, of bending royal traditions for her own benefit. The courtroom revelation seemed to confirm those suspicions in the harshest possible way. To them, this was not simply a wife exposed. It was an architect of deception revealed at last. The gallery included royal correspondents who had tracked Meghan since her entry into the family. Some admitted they had expected drama, but not on this scale. Their reports, filed within minutes, painted her as stoic to the point of chilling. One journalist wrote that her calmness stood in shocking contrast to the devastation unraveling beside her. Another described her as a figure of icy detachment. Even sympathetic voices struggled to frame her reaction positively. How could one justify serenity in the face of a revelation that had shattered her husband? Meghan Exposed, then, was not just about the truth of Archie's paternity. It was about the truth of her character, or at least how it appeared in that courtroom. What did Meghan's defense strategy involve in that critical moment? The exposure of Meghan also carried with it a sense of narrative collapse. For years, she had been cast in different roles depending on perspective: a modernizing force in the monarchy, a victim of racism and bias, a manipulative outsider, a woman in love. The DNA revelation rewrote those roles into a single, damning archetype: the deceiver. The mother who concealed the truth of her child's parentage, The wife who allowed her husband to collapse under the weight of a lie. The duchess who undermined the very institution she had joined. Whether or not those accusations were fair mattered little. Perception had shifted, and in matters of public opinion, perception often becomes reality. At this point, the story extended beyond the courtroom. Outside, protesters shouted slogans of anger, some demanding that Meghan be stripped of titles, others calling for her exile from royal life altogether. Supporters, though fewer in number, countered with chants defending her right to privacy and denouncing the monarchy as oppressive. The division was stark, and the DNA revelation became the flashpoint for debates about race, power, and control within the royal family. Yet amid those debates, the focus on Meghan herself remained relentless. Every movement, every glance, every word she uttered that day was interpreted as evidence of guilt or calculation. What made Meghan exposed such a powerful theme was the sense of inevitability. For years, critics had warned that secrets were being hidden, that truths were being masked. The DNA report tore those masks away. Meghan, who had so often been able to control her narrative through interviews, documentaries, and speeches, found herself trapped in the one place where narrative could not be spun, a courtroom. And in that crucible of fact, she could no longer rely on charm, on selective disclosure, or on carefully crafted statements. The truth was out, and no defense could put it back in the shadows. The ending of this chapter must dwell on the image that defined Meghan in the aftermath, a woman seated alone, her husband carried away, the gallery staring, the cameras outside waiting, the world demanding answers. It was not just a moment of personal exposure. It was a moment of global judgment. Meghan Exposed was the story of a duchess stripped of her defenses, caught between the undeniable facts of science and the unforgiving gaze of the public. Whether she was guilty of deliberate deceit or simply caught in the web of her own decisions, the effect was the same. She stood revealed, vulnerable, and condemned in the court of public opinion. And that exposure would shape every chapter that followed in this unfolding royal crisis. The global media frenzy began within seconds of the announcement. The courtroom revelation was still echoing inside the walls of the British High Court when reporters outside began shouting into microphones, broadcasting to millions the most sensational royal scandal in decades. News tickers across the United Kingdom lit up with urgent banners. Prince Harry not Archie's father. International networks cut into programming, anchors speaking with breathless urgency as they relayed the breaking news. What had once been confined to whispers, speculation, and online conspiracy theories was now a matter of record, delivered with the authority of a court and the weight of scientific proof. And the press, always hungry for scandal, seized it with both hands. In London, tabloid offices exploded into activity. Editors barked orders, headline writers raced to outdo one another, and printers prepared for overnight editions that would fly off stands by morning. One paper opted for the blunt, DNA bombshell shatters Harry. Another chose the dramatic. Archie not his son. Still another leaned into the sensational with Meghan's royal deception exposed. By evening, these headlines were plastered across newsstands, their fonts impossibly large, their impact impossible to ignore. Online outlets, free from the restrictions of print deadlines, moved even faster. Live blogs updated by the second, collating every new development, every shaky video clip, every photograph of Harry being led away from court. The hunger for details was insatiable, and the media was determined to feed it. Across the Atlantic, American broadcasters adopted a slightly different tone. Some framed the story as a tragedy of love and betrayal, focusing on Harry as the sympathetic figure undone by deception. Others highlighted Meghan, drawing on her past interviews and public statements to suggest contradictions and half-truths. Morning talk shows debated endlessly whether the couple's relationship could survive, whether Meghan had known the truth all along, and what the revelation meant for their carefully crafted image in Hollywood circles. On social media, hashtags like #NotHarrySon, #DNA Deception, and #Meghan Exposed trended worldwide within hours. Memes spread like wildfire, some mocking, some sympathetic, all adding to the maelstrom of commentary that blurred the line between fact and entertainment. European outlets brought their own perspectives. French and German newspapers emphasized the constitutional implications, noting that questions of succession and legitimacy could not be ignored. Spanish tabloids drew parallels with their own monarchy scandals, pointing out that royal families across Europe were no strangers to illegitimacy and deception. In Australia and Canada, where the British monarchy still held symbolic sway, broadcasters covered the story as both a domestic and international crisis. Even in countries with little connection to the monarchy, the sheer drama of the scandal captured attention. The spectacle of a prince collapsing in court over a DNA revelation was too sensational to ignore. The frenzy was not confined to journalists. Politicians, celebrities, and public figures weighed in, some with sympathy, others with scorn. A British MP lamented the damage done to the monarchy's reputation, calling it a tragedy that weakens one of our oldest institutions. A Hollywood actress posted on social media, sending love to Harry. No one deserves this humiliation. A well-known commentator sneered that the couple had courted publicity and were now drowning in it. The noise was deafening, and it became nearly impossible to separate genuine analysis from opportunistic grandstanding. Everyone wanted to be part of the conversation, to ride the wave of attention generated by the scandal. At the center of the frenzy were images of Harry slumping in court, of aides carrying him away, of Meghan sitting stone-faced as whispers swirled around her. Though cameras were barred from filming inside the courtroom itself, artists sketched renditions of the scene, and eyewitness descriptions were dramatized in headlines and television reenactments. Outside, photographers captured every angle of Harry's departure, his pale face partially obscured by aides shielding him from the press. Those pictures became iconic almost instantly, symbols of vulnerability and betrayal. They were printed on the front pages of newspapers, shared millions of times online, and discussed in living rooms across the world. Visuals gave the scandal its immediacy, turning an abstract revelation into a tangible human drama. The frenzy also revealed the media's insatiable appetite for royal scandal. For decades, the British press had feasted on the private lives of the monarchy, but this story eclipsed even the divorce of Charles and Diana or the abdication of Edward VIII. It was not merely a matter of marriage or romance. It was a question of bloodline, legitimacy, and betrayal at the most intimate level. The coverage reflected this intensity. Special editions were printed, documentaries commissioned, and endless panels assembled to discuss the implications. Television schedules were rearranged to accommodate extended coverage. Every angle was explored: the science of DNA testing, the psychology of betrayal, the history of royal illegitimacy, the future of the Sussex marriage. The story became a prism through which the media examined every aspect of monarchy and celebrity. The global frenzy reached even those who typically ignored royal affairs. In workplaces, conversations erupted over coffee breaks. On public transport, passengers scrolled through updates on their phones, shaking their heads in disbelief. In classrooms, teachers and students debated the ethics of airing such personal revelations in public. In bars and restaurants, televisions replayed the moment Harry was escorted from court. The story transcended borders, cultures, and languages, uniting people in collective shock and fascination. It was, in every sense, a global event, one that made the monarchy once again the subject of worldwide discussion. Yet amid the frenzy, deeper questions were raised. How had the media managed to turn such a private devastation into spectacle so quickly? Was Harry's collapse treated as tragedy or entertainment? Was Meghan being judged unfairly by a press that had long vilified her? Was the monarchy being protected by narratives that cast her as the sole villain? These questions added layers of complexity to the coverage, though they did little to slow the flood of sensational headlines. The speed and scale of the media response showed how little room there was for reflection. The story was too big, too dramatic, to be tempered by caution. The end of this chapter lies in the recognition that the media frenzy was not a passing storm. It set the tone for everything that followed. By amplifying the drama, by framing the revelation as both tragedy and scandal, the press ensured that the story would not fade quickly. The images of Harry's collapse, Meghan's composure, and the courtroom chaos became embedded in public consciousness. They shaped perceptions, influenced debates, and determined the trajectory of the crisis. In the global media frenzy, the scandal grew from a courtroom revelation into a world-shaking event, one that would define the narrative of Harry, Meghan, and the monarchy for years to come. Betrayal at the highest level was the phrase commentators reached for, and yet even that seemed inadequate to capture the gravity of what had been exposed. A DNA revelation is not just a matter of private heartbreak. It is a rupture of trust, a stripping away of certainty. In Harry's case, it was the betrayal of a man by the very woman he had defended against the world, by the family narrative he had built, and by the image he had tirelessly sought to protect. In the monarchy's case, it was the betrayal of tradition, the violation of a lineage presented as unbroken and inviolable. To understand why this betrayal resonated so deeply, one must look not only at the courtroom itself, but at the centuries of history, loyalty, and expectation that framed it. At its core, betrayal is the breaking of trust. For Harry, trust had been his most fragile possession. Since his mother's death, he had struggled to find it. In the press, in the institution of monarchy, even in his own relatives. Meghan had represented something different, someone who seemed to offer loyalty in a world filled with suspicion. He gave her not only his love but his defense, standing against family tradition, against palace advisors, even against public opinion. And yet in that courtroom, the trust that defined their marriage appeared shattered. To believe that you are raising your son, only to discover he is another man's child, is betrayal at its most personal. For any man, it would be devastating. For a prince, it was catastrophic, for it carried not just emotional pain but constitutional weight. The betrayal reached beyond Harry. The monarchy has always been built on bloodlines, on the idea that royal identity passes unbroken from one generation to the next. That is why so much care is taken in publicizing royal births, baptisms, and genealogies. To introduce doubt into that chain is to introduce instability into the very heart of the institution. Betrayal at the highest level, then, was not just between husband and wife. It was between Meghan and the crown itself. By presenting Archie as Harry's son, Meghan was seen to have deceived the monarchy into accepting a child who had no place in its lineage. Whether or not that was her intention, perception became reality. And in matters of monarchy, perception is often as important as fact. Historical echoes amplified the sense of betrayal. Commentators drew parallels with Edward VIII, who abdicated for love and was branded a traitor to duty. Others recalled the scandals surrounding Charles and Diana, moments when personal lives spilled into public crises. Yet even those paled beside the DNA revelation. Divorce, infidelity, abdication, these are betrayals of vows, of roles, of expectations. But the betrayal of bloodline is something deeper, something that shakes the foundation of monarchy itself. It is a betrayal not only of husband and family, but of history, of continuity, of the very story the monarchy tells about itself. That is why the phrase betrayal at the highest level felt apt. It was betrayal measured not only in personal anguish, but in constitutional consequence. The public felt the betrayal keenly as well. For years, Harry and Meghan had courted sympathy, portraying themselves as victims of a rigid institution and a hostile press. Many had defended them, arguing that their retreat to California was an act of self-preservation, not rebellion. The DNA revelation turned that narrative upside down. Suddenly, those who had championed the couple felt deceived, as though their trust had been exploited. Social media was filled with angry posts from former supporters expressing disillusionment. "We defended you against the world, and this is what you hid," one user wrote. Others declared themselves betrayed not just by Meghan, but by Harry himself, for failing to see, or perhaps refusing to see, the truth. The sense of betrayal spread outward, infecting even those with little interest in the monarchy, because betrayal is a universal story, one that resonates across borders and cultures. Within the palace, betrayal took on a sharper edge. To deceive a husband is tragic. To deceive a family is cruel. But to deceive the crown is unforgivable. Courtiers whispered of fury behind closed doors, of senior royals demanding accountability. The monarchy is an institution that prizes loyalty above all else, and betrayal is met with swift and merciless retribution. The DNA revelation, to them, was not just a scandal but an act of disloyalty on a scale rarely seen. It cast doubt not only on Meghan but on Harry's judgment, on his ability to distinguish loyalty from treachery. To place the wrong person at your side is dangerous in any life. In royal life, it is catastrophic. The betrayal narrative also raised questions about complicity. If Meghan knew, did Harry suspect? If Harry suspected, why did he not act sooner? And if others in the palace had known, why had they allowed the deception to continue? Betrayal at the highest level often involves not just the deceiver and the deceived, but those who turn away, who allow lies to fester. The DNA revelation forced the world to consider whether Harry had been naive, willfully blind, or tragically misled. None of those options painted him in a flattering light. Each suggested that he had been weakened by love, manipulated by devotion, and exposed by loyalty to someone who did not share it. What makes betrayal so powerful is that it touches on the deepest fears of human life. The fear of being deceived, of being made a fool, of giving trust to someone unworthy of it. Harry's collapse, Meghan's composure, the monarchy's silence. All of these were symptoms of betrayal laid bare. For Harry, the betrayal was personal. For the monarchy, it was institutional. For the public, it was symbolic. Each audience experienced it differently, but all recognized it for what it was, a wound that cut to the bone. The end of this chapter lies in the recognition that betrayal, once exposed, cannot be undone. Trust, once broken, cannot be fully restored. Harry may find ways to rebuild. Meghan may seek to defend herself. The monarchy may attempt to close ranks, but the betrayal at the highest level will remain etched in history. It will be cited in documentaries, analyzed in books, debated in classrooms, and whispered about for generations. It is the kind of betrayal that becomes legend, not because of the scandal alone, but because of the way it touched every level of human and institutional life. At the personal level, it destroyed a man. At the familial level, it divided relatives. At the institutional level, it threatened the crown. And at the public level, it confirmed what so many fear, that trust, even in its purest form, is always fragile. King Charles and the palace reaction unfolded behind closed doors. Yet enough whispers emerged to paint a picture of fury, disbelief, and strategic calculation. The monarchy, long practiced in the art of managing scandal, found itself confronting something it had never faced in modern history. Questions of infidelity, divorce, and abdication had plagued it before, but never had the issue of bloodline, the core of royal legitimacy, been challenged with such brutal clarity. The palace, often accused of moving slowly, acted with uncharacteristic speed, summoning advisors, lawyers, and press officers into emergency meetings that lasted late into the night. For King Charles, the revelation was not just about his son's humiliation, but about the survival of the institution he had waited a lifetime to lead. Those close to the king described his reaction as a mixture of cold rage and deep sorrow. On one hand, there was anger at Meghan for bringing shame and instability into the family. On the other, there was pity for Harry, the son who had already borne so much loss and now carried the unbearable burden of betrayal. Yet Charles was also a monarch, and monarchy does not allow for decisions made purely from emotion. Advisors reminded him that the scandal had constitutional implications, that it threatened not just family relationships but the perception of the crown itself. The king, they said, understood this immediately. His role was not merely to comfort or condemn, but to preserve the institution, and that meant decisive action. The first priority was control of the narrative. Palace press officers scrambled to craft statements that were both firm and cautious. Acknowledge the gravity of the moment, they advised, but do not allow the monarchy to be dragged into personal disputes. The palace, after all, had to appear above the fray. Yet the problem was that the DNA revelation was not merely personal. It cut directly into issues of legitimacy, inheritance, and succession. The crown could not pretend it was uninvolved, and so the palace walked a tightrope. Behind the walls of Buckingham Palace, drafts of statements were written and rewritten, some too harsh, others too vague, all struggling to strike the impossible balance between compassion and authority. Reports later suggested that Charles himself considered making a personal statement, something rare for a monarch. He understood the need to project stability, to assure the public that the crown remained secure even as one of its princes collapsed in scandal. Yet he was counseled against it by senior advisors, who feared that any words he spoke would tie the monarchy too closely to the details of the revelation. Better, they argued, to allow surrogates, trusted friends of the crown, sympathetic commentators, unnamed sources, to shape the narrative indirectly. And so the palace's official stance remained muted, a brief acknowledgement of personal matters being handled privately, even as leaks painted a picture of a king enraged and a family fractured. Inside the palace, the reactions of other royals played a role in shaping the mood. Queen Camilla, long a figure of resilience in her own right, was said to have been unsparing in her judgment of Meghan. To deceive Harry, she reportedly told confidants, was one thing. To deceive the crown was unforgivable. Princess, and, ever blunt, is said to have demanded clarity on titles and inheritance immediately. The monarchy, in her view, could not afford ambiguity. William, though not directly present in the emergency meetings, communicated his views through trusted intermediaries. He was furious, not only at the scandal itself, but at the renewed damage to the family's reputation. His bond with Harry, already strained, now seemed beyond repair. Kate, quieter but no less resolute, was said to have expressed sympathy for Harry privately while supporting William's firm stance publicly. The palace reaction also included a review of legal avenues. Could Archie retain any titles if his paternity was disputed? Could Meghan face consequences for any false representations, whether intentional or not? Lawyers examined precedents, both ancient and modern, combing through centuries of royal law for guidance. The answers were murky. There had been cases of disputed legitimacy in the distant past, but none in the age of DNA testing and mass media. The monarchy had always relied on ceremony and tradition to confirm lineage. Science, cold and impartial, had never been so publicly involved. This was uncharted territory, and the palace knew it. For Charles personally, the scandal was a bitter irony. He had spent decades preparing to be king, enduring scandal after scandal in his own life, believing that the institution could survive anything as long as bloodline remained secure. Now, in the very first years of his reign, that foundation was being shaken. The betrayal of Harry was painful as a father. The exposure of Meghan was infuriating as a monarch, but the danger to the crown was what kept him awake at night. Would the public still trust the monarchy if it appeared unable to guarantee even the legitimacy of its members? Would the scandal reignite Republican sentiment, already simmering in parts of the Commonwealth? These questions loomed over every decision. The media frenzy amplified the palace's challenges. No matter how carefully they tried to manage the narrative, the press was determined to frame it as a crisis of monarchy. The images of Harry collapsing, of Meghan's composure, of the courtroom chaos, were splashed across front pages. Commentators debated whether the monarchy itself could survive such exposure. International outlets questioned whether this was the beginning of the end for an institution many viewed as archaic. Charles understood the danger of silence, but he also knew that overreaction could entangle the crown further. The palace's traditional strategy of never complain, never explain seemed inadequate for a scandal of this magnitude. The palace also had to manage its staff. Courtiers, who prided themselves on loyalty and discretion, found themselves overwhelmed by inquiries from journalists, friends, and even distant relatives. Rumors spread quickly, some claiming that Charles had already decided to strip Harry and Meghan of titles, others suggesting that Archie and Lilibet would be quietly removed from the line of succession. The lack of official clarity only fueled speculation. In private, Charles wrestled with the decision. To strip titles would appear harsh, vindictive, and risk making Harry a martyr. To do nothing, however, would suggest weakness, an inability to defend the integrity of the crown. Both options carried peril. What became clear in those hours and days was that the palace reaction was not simply about damage control. It was about survival. The monarchy had faced scandals before, but never one so entwined with science, with truth that could not be spun or softened. The betrayal had been laid bare, the legitimacy questioned, the family exposed. Charles, for all his experience and resilience, faced the greatest test of his reign. Could he preserve the monarchy in the face of betrayal at the highest level? Could he reassure the public that the crown remained stable, even as his own son lay broken by scandal? The palace's reaction would not be judged by its words, but by its ability to weather the storm. The end of this chapter rests on the image of Buckingham Palace itself. Its walls, ancient and imposing, had seen wars, abdications, divorces, and deaths. Yet on this night, as advisors hurried through its corridors and the king weighed impossible choices, those walls seemed less like symbols of stability and more like barriers against an encroaching tide. The betrayal had reached the heart of the monarchy, and the palace reaction, no matter how carefully orchestrated, could not erase it. It could only attempt to contain it, to shield the crown from collapse even as the family within it fractured. And so the palace braced itself, knowing that the days ahead would determine not only the fate of Harry and Meghan, but the credibility of the monarchy itself. William and Kate's position emerged quickly in the aftermath of the courtroom shock, and their response was just as crucial to the palace narrative as the king's. For years, the brothers had been estranged, their relationship fractured by disputes over loyalty, duty, and the choices Harry made after marrying Meghan. Now, with the DNA revelation tearing apart the foundation of Harry's family, William found himself in a position of both anger and vindication. To those close to him, it was no surprise that his reaction was fierce, for this was not only about his brother. It was about the survival of the monarchy he would one day inherit. The first reports from palace insiders described William as furious, not only at Meghan but at the damage Harry's marriage had once again inflicted on the royal household. He was said to have paced the halls of Kensington Palace, demanding briefings, asking how much had been known, and insisting that the family act quickly to preserve the monarchy's credibility. His frustration was sharpened by years of watching his brother defend Meghan against every criticism, only to now see that loyalty rewarded with betrayal. "I warned him," he was reported to have said to a confidant, a phrase that echoed through commentary and headlines alike. To William, this was confirmation of every concern he had once expressed, every warning he had once given, and it hardened his resolve to protect the institution he would one day lead. Kate's reaction, though quieter, was no less significant. She had long been cast as the calm counterbalance to William's intensity, and in this moment her role was to provide stability. Insiders described her as sympathetic toward Harry, privately expressing sorrow for his suffering, but equally firm in her belief that the monarchy must draw clear lines. For Kate, the betrayal was not only of Harry but of the entire royal family, which had welcomed Archie into its lineage without question. She reportedly told those close to her that compassion for Harry did not erase the need for accountability. Her public face remained serene, her statements carefully measured, but behind the scenes she was a steadying force for William, encouraging him to channel his fury into strategy rather than outburst. The middle of this chapter focuses on how William and Kate balanced personal emotion with public responsibility. William's anger was visceral. He had grown up watching his family's mistakes play out on the world stage, and he had dedicated his adult life to avoiding similar disasters. The DNA revelation represented everything he feared: scandal, betrayal, instability, and doubt about the monarchy's future. He viewed Meghan not just as a problematic sister-in-law, but as a direct threat to the crown. Kate, ever conscious of public perception, urged caution in how that anger was expressed. She reminded William that while the monarchy could not appear weak, it also could not appear cruel. Their discussions, described by insiders as intense but measured, shaped the palace's next moves. Together, they represented the generation that would inherit the throne, and their stance would determine how the public judged the monarchy's response. The couple's position also highlighted the widening gulf between the brothers. William had long viewed Harry as reckless, emotional, and easily influenced. The collapse in court only reinforced that image in his mind. Where he saw weakness, he contrasted his own determination to project strength. This contrast did not go unnoticed by the public. Media outlets framed William as the future king rising to the occasion, while Harry was portrayed as the broken prince undone by betrayal. Kate's quiet dignity was set against Meghan's stoic detachment, fueling endless comparisons between the two women. The narrative of two brothers on opposite paths, already a familiar theme, took on new urgency in the wake of the DNA scandal. Publicly, William and Kate remained restrained. They did not issue direct statements, leaving the palace to speak for the family as a whole. But their silence was itself a position. It allowed commentators to speculate freely, filling the void with interpretations that often cast them as the responsible heirs in contrast to the chaos surrounding Harry and Meghan. Behind closed doors, however, they were active participants in shaping the palace's strategy. William pressed for clarity on Archie's titles and succession rights, insisting that ambiguity would only fuel further scandal. Kate emphasized the need to appear compassionate toward Harry, to show the public that the monarchy could be both firm and humane. Together, their approach balanced steel with sympathy, a combination that reinforced their image as the monarchy's stable future. The betrayal also touched William and Kate on a personal level. For years, William had struggled to reconcile his love for his brother with his duty to the crown. He had hoped for reconciliation, even after the damaging interviews and the accusations hurled by Harry and Meghan. But the DNA revelation seemed to extinguish that hope. Insiders suggested that William viewed this as the final break, the point of no return in their relationship. Kate, who had once encouraged William to leave the door open for Harry's return, now appeared to share his doubts. The couple, united in both grief and resolve, recognized that the monarchy could not afford to be weakened by endless divisions. Their loyalty was to the crown first, family second. The ending of this chapter rests on the image of William and Kate standing together, a portrait of determination in the face of chaos. William, furious but resolute, embodying the role of protector of the monarchy. Kate, composed and compassionate, embodying the role of steady guide. Together, they represented a contrast to Harry and Meghan, where one couple seemed broken, the other appeared unshakable. This contrast was not just personal, but symbolic, shaping how the world viewed the future of the monarchy. William and Kate's position was clear. The betrayal could not be ignored. The monarchy must be defended, and the line between personal tragedy and institutional survival must be drawn firmly. In their stance, the public saw not just a response to scandal, but a glimpse of the leadership that would one day define the crown. Meghan's defense strategy unfolded almost immediately after the DNA revelation, for she knew that silence would only deepen suspicion. With Harry carried out of the courtroom and the press already framing her as the architect of betrayal, she turned to the one weapon she had relied on throughout her public life: narrative control. Her legal team began shaping arguments that sought to soften the impact of science with appeals to humanity. Parenthood, they insisted, is not defined by biology, but by love. Harry, they argued, had been a devoted father to Archie from the very beginning, and no test could erase the bond they had built. It was an argument designed not for the courtroom, but for the court of public opinion, where sentiment often carries more weight than fact. The opening move in her strategy was composure. Meghan refused to break down, refused to appear flustered, refused to give her critics the image of guilt they so desperately craved. Instead, she leaned on her lawyers, whispered directions, and carried herself with the poise of someone who still believed she could control the storm. Her supporters pointed to this composure as strength, evidence that she would not allow the press to destroy her. Her detractors, however, saw it as proof of foreknowledge, of a woman who had long known the truth and prepared her mask in advance. The very thing that Meghan intended as resilience was twisted into evidence of deceit. The next step was to reframe the narrative around victimhood. Through allies in the media and sympathetic voices in Hollywood, Meghan positioned herself as the target of a smear campaign. She argued that the obsession with DNA and bloodline was a relic of a bygone age, one that reduced children to genetic markers rather than human beings. In carefully worded statements, she emphasized the cruelty of exposing such personal details in public, asking whether Archie deserved to grow up under the shadow of scandal. The aim was clear: to redirect outrage away from herself and toward the institution that had allowed such a revelation to dominate global headlines. If she could convince enough people that the monarchy was to blame, she might shift the focus from betrayal to injustice. At the same time, Meghan leaned heavily on themes of modernity and progress. In interviews given before the scandal, she had often positioned herself as a reformer, someone unafraid to challenge outdated traditions. Now, In the wake of the DNA revelation, that framing became a shield. She suggested that the obsession with bloodline was itself outdated, that the true measure of family was love and commitment. It was a strategy designed to resonate with younger audiences, especially in America, where the monarchy's symbolism carried less weight. By reframing the scandal as a clash between old-world tradition and modern values, she sought to turn herself from deceiver into disruptor, from liar into liberator. Her defense strategy also relied on silence in key moments. Meghan has long understood that every word she utters is magnified, dissected, and weaponized. In the days immediately following the revelation, she allowed surrogates to speak for her, friends, allies, commentators who painted her as a woman once again under siege. By not speaking directly, she avoided the risk of contradiction or overexposure, while still ensuring that her perspective shaped the narrative. When she finally did appear publicly, it was in carefully curated settings, where questions were limited and her words could be controlled. She spoke of love, of resilience, of the cruelty of intrusion, never directly addressing the question of who Archie's biological father might be. The middle of this chapter examines how effective these strategies were. On one level, they succeeded in rallying her base of supporters, who saw her once again as a woman unfairly targeted by an institution determined to destroy her. Hashtags defending Meghan trended alongside those condemning her, proof that the scandal had not silenced her defenders. On another level, however, her strategy faltered. The clarity of the DNA test was difficult to spin. Science left no room for ambiguity, and no amount of narrative control could erase the fact that the report had been read into record. Critics pointed to her refusal to address the central question, who is the father, as proof that she had something to hide. The longer she avoided it, the louder the speculation grew. Meghan's defense also highlighted the limits of PR in the face of hard fact. In the past, she and Harry had successfully shaped narratives through interviews, documentaries, and memoirs. They had spoken directly to the public, bypassing traditional media, and found receptive audiences. But the DNA revelation was not a matter of perspective, it was a matter of record. The courtroom did not bend to spin, and the press, armed with a definitive document, did not need her cooperation to tell the story. Her strategy of reframing and deflection, while powerful in some contexts, could not fully blunt the impact of the revelation. The more she tried to shift the narrative, the more it seemed she was avoiding the truth. The final component of Meghan's strategy was to emphasize Archie's innocence. She repeatedly invoked the child's right to privacy, the cruelty of forcing him into the spotlight of scandal, and the need to protect him from the mistakes of adults. This was perhaps her most effective tactic, for it resonated even with critics who despised her. Few could argue that the child deserved to bear the weight of headlines and speculation. By focusing on Archie, Meghan sought to cast herself as a protective mother rather than a deceptive wife. It was an attempt to reclaim sympathy, to remind the world that behind the scandal was a boy whose life had just been rewritten. The ending of this chapter acknowledges the precariousness of Meghan's defense. On one side, she had her composure, her allies, her appeals to modernity, and her emphasis on motherhood. On the other side, she faced the immovable truth of DNA, the perception of betrayal, and the fury of a monarchy determined to preserve its legitimacy. Her strategy kept her afloat, but only just. Every word she spoke, every silence she maintained, every gesture she made was scrutinized for evidence of guilt or innocence. Meghan's defense strategy was not a shield strong enough to stop the arrows. It was a dance meant to keep her moving, to prevent the world from pinning her down. Whether it would be enough to save her reputation, her marriage, or her place in history remained an open question. Public reaction to the DNA revelation and the courtroom collapse was immediate, raw, and global. What began as a breaking news alert rippled outward into living rooms, workplaces, streets, and social media feeds across the world. People who had long ignored royal affairs suddenly found themselves glued to screens, debating not just the personal tragedy of Prince Harry, but the broader implications for the monarchy. Reactions came in waves, first shock, then anger, then speculation, each more intense than the last. It was as if the world had been handed a drama that combined the intimacy of a family betrayal with the magnitude of a constitutional crisis. In Britain, where loyalty to the monarchy is woven into the fabric of national life, the response was especially visceral. On the streets of London, people stopped in pubs and cafes to watch news bulletins replaying the details. Conversations shifted instantly to the scandal, strangers debating across tables whether Meghan had betrayed the family, whether Harry had been willfully blind, whether the monarchy itself could withstand such humiliation. Some reacted with outrage, demanding that Meghan be stripped of her titles and exiled from royal life. Others expressed pity for Harry, calling him a victim of manipulation who had been humiliated before the entire world. Still others, skeptical of the monarchy in general, saw the scandal as proof that the institution was outdated and fragile, its reverence for bloodline exposed as both cruel and absurd. In America, where Harry and Meghan had cultivated their post-royal brand, the reaction was more divided. Supporters of Meghan framed the revelation as yet another example of the monarchy and the British press conspiring to destroy her, seizing on the cruelty of making private DNA results public. They flooded social media with hashtags like #StandWithMeghan and #ProtectArchie, arguing that motherhood should not be reduced to biology. But critics were equally loud, denouncing Meghan as deceptive and manipulative, accusing her of orchestrating a fraud on a global scale. Talk shows and podcasts dissected the drama with relentless energy, some framing it as a Shakespearean tragedy, others as the inevitable collapse of a couple who had courted publicity and now faced its unforgiving consequences. In the Commonwealth, the reactions carried political undertones. In Canada and Australia, Republican movements gained sudden momentum, with commentators pointing to the scandal as evidence that hereditary monarchy had no place in modern governance. In the Caribbean, where resentment toward colonial-era institutions had already fueled debates about cutting ties with the crown, the scandal was cited as proof of the monarchy's hypocrisy. How could an institution claim dignity and continuity when its own bloodlines were under question? The revelation became fuel for arguments that the monarchy was not only outdated but morally compromised, unable to uphold even the standards it imposed on others. On social media, the public reaction was chaotic and relentless. Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok became arenas of fierce debate, where sympathy and scorn clashed in equal measure. Memes spread rapidly. Images of Harry collapsing captioned with biting commentary, side-by-side photos of Meghan in court compared with icy fictional characters, hashtags that trended globally within hours. Some users mocked the royals, others wept for Harry, and others used the moment to highlight broader issues of trust, betrayal, and family secrets. The sheer volume of commentary was overwhelming, creating a storm of noise that made it difficult to distinguish fact from speculation. Yet amid the noise, one truth was clear. The scandal had captured the attention of the world in a way few stories ever had. Public reaction was not only emotional, but also analytical. Experts were invited onto television panels to explain the implications of the DNA revelation. Geneticists clarified the reliability of DNA testing, emphasizing its near certainty. Legal analysts debated what the findings meant for succession laws and titles. Psychologists were interviewed about the likely toll on Harry, Meghan, and their children, warning of trauma and long-lasting scars. Even historians were called upon, asked to place the scandal in the context of past royal crises. For the public, these analyses offered structure to the chaos, transforming raw outrage into informed debate. Yet they also reinforced the magnitude of the scandal, showing that it was not simply gossip, but a matter with real legal, historical, and emotional weight. The human reaction, however, remained the most powerful. In homes across the world, people related to the story on a personal level. Parents asked themselves how they would feel if they discovered a child was not biologically theirs. Spouses wondered how they would react to such betrayal. Children wondered what it would mean to learn their father was not truly their father. The universality of the emotions, betrayal, grief, deception, made the scandal resonate beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace or the courtroom. This was not just a royal crisis, it was a human one, and that is why the public reaction was so intense. The scandal also drew out raw divisions in public perception of Meghan. To her critics, the DNA revelation was the ultimate confirmation of what they had always believed, that she was untrustworthy, manipulative, and dangerous to the monarchy. To her supporters, it was yet another example of a woman vilified beyond reason, her every move twisted into evidence of guilt. These polarized views clashed violently online, creating echo chambers where one side saw a villain and the other saw a victim. The public reaction, then, was not a single voice but a chorus of competing narratives, each amplifying the drama in different ways. The ending of this chapter rests on the recognition that public reaction did not fade with time. It grew. In the days after the revelation, protests erupted outside Buckingham Palace, petitions circulated demanding action, and op-eds filled newspapers around the world. Television specials promised deeper coverage, while publishers rushed to sign book deals offering insider perspectives. The scandal became not just a story but an industry, a source of endless commentary, speculation, and profit. And at the heart of it all was the simple, devastating truth revealed in that courtroom. Harry was not Archie's father. That truth ignited the public like a spark in dry tinder, and the blaze it created would not easily be extinguished. Expert opinions poured in almost immediately after the courtroom revelation, as media networks scrambled to provide context, analysis, and a sense of authority to a story that seemed too sensational to be real. Scientists, lawyers, psychologists, and royal historians were called upon to explain what the DNA revelation meant not just for Harry and Meghan, but for the monarchy, for public perception, and even for constitutional law. The reliance on expert voices reflected the gravity of the situation. This was not just gossip or rumor. It was a fact presented in a court of law, and the world demanded explanations from those who understood its implications. The scientific experts were the first to speak. Geneticists appeared on news programs to explain the certainty of DNA testing. One leading expert emphasized that modern DNA tests, when conducted under strict conditions, have an accuracy rate of more than 99.9%. There was no wiggle room, no space for speculation about error. The fact that the results had been presented in court meant that chain of custody procedures had been followed, and that tampering or mislabeling was almost impossible. Viewers were reminded that DNA is the gold standard of biological proof, used in criminal investigations, paternity disputes, and even cases of exoneration. The implication was clear. The revelation was not a mistake, not a rumor, but an irrefutable fact. Legal experts followed closely behind, analyzing what the revelation meant for Archie's place in the royal family. Under British law, titles and inheritance rights are tied directly to bloodlines. If Harry was not Archie's biological father, questions arose about whether Archie had any legitimate claim to titles or succession. Some legal scholars argued that titles already granted could be revoked if fraud or misrepresentation were proven. Others cautioned that the monarchy might prefer to avoid legal entanglement, fearing the damage of prolonged battles. Yet all agreed that the scandal raised unprecedented constitutional questions. Could a child publicly revealed not to be the biological son of a prince remain in the line of succession? And if so, what did that say about the integrity of the monarchy's traditions? Psychologists added a human layer to the analysis. They spoke of the devastating impact such a revelation would have on Harry's mental health, noting his long history of trauma and anxiety. One psychologist explained that betrayal at this level can trigger symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress, especially when compounded by public humiliation. They predicted that Harry might struggle with trust for years, that his collapse in court was not just physical exhaustion, but the visible breaking point of a man who had been carrying too much pain for too long. Psychologists also speculated on the impact on Archie. To grow up under the shadow of such a revelation, they said, would be deeply destabilizing, raising questions of identity, belonging, and legitimacy. The child, they argued, was the true victim, caught in a storm of adult deceit and institutional expectations. Royal historians were equally vocal, placing the scandal in the broader context of monarchy. They pointed out that illegitimacy and disputed paternity were not new to royal families. Throughout history, whispers of affairs and questionable bloodlines had plagued monarchies across Europe. But never before had such questions been confirmed with scientific certainty, and never in such a public and global way. One historian compared the scandal to the abdication crisis of Edward VIII, another to the divorce of Charles and Diana, but emphasized that the DNA revelation went deeper. This is not about who a royal chooses to marry or how they conduct their private lives, one expert said. This is about the very essence of monarchy. Bloodline. If you shake that foundation, the entire institution trembles. Some experts focused on the media dimension, analyzing how the scandal was being consumed and amplified. They noted that the speed of modern information flow meant the revelation had spread across the globe within minutes, shaping public opinion before the palace had time to respond. Media analysts warned that the monarchy was fighting not just a scandal, but an information war, one in which perception mattered as much as fact. They emphasized that Meghan's defense strategy of reframing the narrative would face enormous challenges in a landscape dominated by viral headlines and relentless commentary. Once the image of betrayal had taken hold, they argued, it would be nearly impossible to dislodge. Financial experts also weighed in, noting that the scandal could have economic consequences. The monarchy, though funded largely by public money, relies on public goodwill to justify its expense. If that goodwill eroded, pressure could mount to reduce funding or sever ties in Commonwealth nations. The Sussexes themselves, now heavily invested in media projects and partnerships, faced risks as well. Brands and organizations often shy away from controversy, and some analysts predicted that deals with Netflix, Spotify, or publishers could be reconsidered in light of the scandal. For Meghan, who had positioned herself as a global figure of empowerment and authenticity, the accusation of deception was particularly damaging. The middle of this chapter must linger on the diversity of expert voices. Each spoke from their own field: science, law, psychology, history, media, finance, but together they painted a picture of a scandal that touched every aspect of life. It was not just personal but institutional, not just emotional but legal, not just private but global. The sheer range of expert commentary underscored the magnitude of the revelation. This was not a story confined to gossip magazines. It was a story that required the attention of geneticists, constitutional scholars, and historians. That fact alone elevated the scandal from drama to crisis. The ending of this chapter acknowledges that expert opinions, while valuable, could not soften the blow. They explain the accuracy of DNA, the implications for succession, the trauma for Harry, the precedents in history. But they could not erase the simple, devastating truth. Science had spoken, and its verdict was clear. Expert voices gave structure to chaos, but the chaos remained. For the public, the experts only reinforced what they already knew in their hearts: that this was betrayal at the deepest level, a wound that no explanation could heal. Historical echoes of the DNA revelation began to dominate commentary in the days that followed, as journalists and historians alike sought to anchor the scandal in a longer chain of royal crises. Monarchies have always thrived on continuity, on the idea that their bloodlines are sacred and unbroken. But history has shown, time and again, that these bloodlines are rarely as pure or unquestioned as they are presented to be. The revelation about Harry and Archie did not emerge in a vacuum. It was the latest in a centuries-old tradition of whispered illegitimacy, concealed affairs, and carefully managed truths. What made this moment different was that the whispers were replaced by science, and the speculation was replaced by certainty. One of the most frequently invoked historical parallels was the scandal of Edward VIII, who abdicated the throne in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson. Though the issue there was not bloodline, the crisis was framed in similar terms of betrayal: betrayal of duty, betrayal of tradition, betrayal of the crown. Commentators noted that Edward's decision had shaken the monarchy's credibility and forced it into a period of reinvention under George VI and later Elizabeth II. The DNA revelation, they argued, carried the same destabilizing potential. Where Edward's abdication raised questions about loyalty to crown and country, Harry's scandal raised questions about the bloodlines that underpin monarchy itself. Both crises forced the institution to confront uncomfortable truths, and both left scars that would last for generations. Others drew comparisons with the many illegitimacy scandals that dotted European history. In France, rumors of kings fathering children outside of marriage were so common they were practically expected. In Spain and Italy, succession crises were triggered by disputes over who was truly legitimate. In Britain itself, whispers of illegitimate children haunted monarchs from the medieval period onward. Yet in those times, rumor was enough. There was no scientific certainty, no laboratory proof, only gossip and suspicion. Monarchies managed these scandals by either acknowledging bastards openly or denying them entirely, depending on political convenience. What set Harry's case apart was that science had left no room for denial. DNA replaced gossip, and that made the scandal uniquely destructive. The echoes of the Charles and Diana era also rang loudly in public memory. Diana herself had once faced speculation about Harry's paternity, with cruel rumors suggesting that he resembled James Hewitt more than Charles. Though those rumors were baseless, they revealed how obsessed the public was with bloodline and legitimacy. For Harry to now face similar questions about his own child was seen as a cruel twist of fate, a cycle of suspicion repeating across generations. Some commentators described it as Shakespearean irony, the sins of rumor revisiting the son in the harshest possible way. The comparison only deepened the tragedy, reminding the world that Harry's life had always been shadowed by doubts about lineage, and now he was at the center of a scandal that confirmed them for his own family. Royal historians also pointed to past cases where illegitimacy reshaped entire dynasties. The Wars of the Roses, they noted, were fueled in part by disputes over legitimacy and claims to the throne. The Glorious Revolution of 1688, which deposed James II, was partly driven by suspicions that his son had been smuggled into the bedchamber, not truly born of the Queen. These historical crises showed that nothing threatened monarchy more than doubt about bloodlines. When the public or the nobility believed they were being deceived about lineage, rebellion or rejection often followed. The DNA revelation, therefore, was not just a personal scandal. It was the kind of crisis that had historically toppled kings and reshaped nations. The middle of this chapter explores how these historical echoes were used by different factions. For monarchists, the comparisons were warnings, proof that the crown had survived worse and could survive again if it acted decisively. They pointed to George VI restoring dignity after Edward VIII, or Elizabeth II guiding the monarchy through decades of change. For Republicans, the echoes were evidence that monarchy was inherently unstable, always vulnerable to scandal, always reliant on illusions that could be shattered at any moment. They argued that the DNA revelation proved monarchy was an outdated system, one that collapsed under the weight of its own obsession with bloodlines whenever truth intruded. Both sides used history as a weapon, framing the present crisis in narratives that suited their agendas. Public perception was shaped by these echoes as well. For ordinary people, the historical comparisons gave context to the drama, showing that royal scandal was not new but part of a long tradition. Yet it also made the betrayal feel larger, more significant, because it was now linked to moments that had defined or endangered monarchies in the past. The idea that Harry's DNA scandal could be remembered alongside Edward's abdication or the Glorious Revolution gave the story an almost mythic weight. It was no longer just about one family or one marriage. It was about the continuity of monarchy itself, a chapter in a saga stretching back centuries. The ending of this chapter emphasizes that history's echoes are both warning and prophecy. They show that monarchy has endured scandal before, but they also reveal how fragile it is when questions of bloodline arise. From Edward VIII to James II to Diana, the institution has repeatedly been shaken by issues of legitimacy and betrayal. The DNA revelation was the modern iteration of that ancient problem, updated with the precision of science and amplified by global media. It was a reminder that for all the pomp and ceremony, monarchy remains vulnerable to the same human weaknesses, secrecy, deception, betrayal, that have always threatened it. And just as history remembers those past crises, so too will it remember this one, a scandal destined to echo in chronicles of the crown for generations to come. The future of Archie and Lilibet became one of the most pressing and painful questions after the DNA revelation. If Harry was not Archie's biological father, What did that mean for the children's place in the royal family, for their titles, for their inheritance, and most importantly, for their sense of identity? The monarchy has always treated children as symbols of continuity, as living proof of the unbroken line that stretches back centuries. But now, with doubt cast over that continuity, Archie and his sister Lilibet were caught in a storm not of their making. The debate over their future was not just legal or constitutional. It was deeply human, a clash between tradition, truth, and compassion. The immediate question was legitimacy. Archie had been born into the royal family with all the pomp and attention that entailed, though Harry and Meghan had chosen to shield many details. He had been given a name that connected him to both British tradition and American independence. Later, Lilibet was born, named after the late Queen, a gesture that tied her symbolically to the heart of the monarchy. Both children were entered into the line of succession, a move that carried immense significance. Now, with science declaring that Archie was not Harry's son, commentators questioned whether either child had a rightful place in that lineage. If Archie was not legitimate, did that cast doubt on Lilibet as well? The public, hungry for clarity, demanded answers, and the monarchy could not provide them quickly enough. For Archie himself, the personal implications were staggering. Children understand identity first through family, through the simple certainty of who their parents are. To grow up under the shadow of a DNA scandal is to grow up with questions that cut to the core of selfhood. Who was my father? Why was I told otherwise? Why did the world know before I did? Experts warned that the psychological toll could be profound, leaving scars that would follow him into adulthood. Worse still, Archie's story was not private, it was global. Every article, every broadcast, every social media post carried his name, making it impossible for him to escape the shadow of revelation. Even if the monarchy sought to shield him, the internet had already preserved his story forever. Lilibet's future, though less directly tied to the DNA report, was equally uncertain. If doubts lingered about Archie, would those doubts spill over to her? The fact that her name honored Elizabeth II had once been seen as a bridge between Harry and the monarchy. Now, it became a cruel irony. Could a child named after the Queen herself be excluded from the royal family if her brother's legitimacy was in question? The symbolic weight was enormous. Some argued that the monarchy might quietly separate the children from official roles, allowing them to grow up privately in America without the burden of titles or expectations. Others believed the crown would hold firm, refusing to admit doubt publicly for fear of undermining the institution. In either case, the children were trapped in decisions made long before they could speak for themselves. The middle of this chapter examines the public debate over the children's inheritance and titles. Some royalists demanded that Archie be removed from the line of succession immediately, arguing that bloodline was non-negotiable. To them, allowing him to remain would be to undermine the integrity of the crown itself. Others, however, pointed out that the monarchy had always blended bloodline with symbolism, and that to punish a child for the actions of his parents would be cruel. Public opinion split sharply along these lines, with compassion clashing against tradition. The debate reflected larger cultural questions. Is family defined by blood or by love? Is legitimacy a matter of biology or of recognition? These questions had resonance far beyond Buckingham Palace, touching on issues faced by families everywhere. The monarchy's silence only heightened the uncertainty. Palace insiders leaked that discussions were underway about how to handle the matter of succession, but no official statements were made. Some speculated that the crown would quietly adjust legal documents, removing Archie and Lilibet without public announcement. Others believed the monarchy would do nothing, hoping the scandal would fade and the children could remain in the line without further controversy. Yet each day without clarity added fuel to speculation. For the children, it meant that their identities remained suspended, neither fully recognized nor fully rejected, caught in limbo while the institution debated their futures. For Meghan, the children became central to her defense. She emphasized her role as a protective mother, arguing that the obsession with DNA and titles was cruel to two innocent children. In interviews and statements, she framed Archie and Lilibet as victims of an archaic system that cared more about blood than about love. This strategy resonated with some audiences, particularly in America, where the monarchy's emphasis on lineage seemed foreign and outdated. But it also drew criticism, with detractors accusing Meghan of hiding behind her children, using them as shields against accountability. Either way, the children were no longer simply Harry and Meghan's. They had become symbols in a global debate about legitimacy and compassion. The ending of this chapter reflects on the tragedy of children caught in scandal. Archie and Lilibet did not choose their circumstances, did not create the deception, did not ask to be born into a monarchy under scrutiny. Yet they would bear the consequences for life. Their futures, once seen as secure within the royal lineage, were now uncertain. Would they grow up as private citizens in America, free from the burdens of titles, but forever shadowed by scandal? Or would they remain nominally in the line of succession, their names present but contested, symbols of an unresolved wound in the monarchy? No matter the decision, their lives had already been shaped by forces beyond their control. The future of Archie and Lilibet, then, was not just a question of titles or inheritance. It was a question of how two children would navigate a world where their very identities had been made public debate, their family story written in headlines rather than in love. Financial fallout became the next unavoidable storm once the DNA revelation sank in. Royal scandals have always carried reputational costs. But in the modern era, where the monarchy's symbolic power intersects with billion-dollar industries of media, branding, and philanthropy, financial consequences are just as important as public opinion. For Harry and Meghan, whose post-royal life was built on commercial deals and public credibility, the scandal threatened to unravel the very foundation of their livelihood. For the monarchy, which relies on taxpayer support and public goodwill, the risk was equally real. Money, as much as bloodline, now stood in the balance. The first ripple hit the Sussexes' commercial empire. Since stepping back from senior royal duties, Harry and Meghan had carved out a new identity as global celebrities, signing lucrative deals with streaming giants, publishers, and brands eager to capitalize on their story. Netflix had paid millions for documentaries. Spotify had partnered with Meghan on podcasts. Publishers had offered record-breaking advances for memoirs and lifestyle books. All of these deals relied on one thing: credibility. Their narrative as a couple wronged by the monarchy, building an independent life in America, resonated because it was authentic, at least in appearance. The DNA revelation cracked that authenticity wide open. Suddenly, Meghan's image as a truth-teller and Harry's memoirs as heartfelt confessions seemed tainted by deception. Analysts predicted that contracts might be reviewed, partnerships reconsidered, and future opportunities jeopardized. In Hollywood, reputation is currency, and Meghan's reputation was now under siege. Publicists whispered that brands might distance themselves quietly, avoiding formal announcements, but simply declining future collaborations. For companies that thrive on image, association with scandal can be poison. While some might be tempted to exploit the drama for publicity, most preferred stability. Meghan's attempts to pivot toward motherhood and philanthropy were complicated by accusations of deceit, while Harry's image as a devoted father, so central to his appeal, was shattered by the DNA report. Financial experts predicted that their marketability would decline, that speaking fees, media deals, and endorsements would shrink in value as public trust eroded. The second ripple hit Invictus, the international sporting event for wounded veterans that Harry had championed for years. Invictus had long been seen as Harry's crowning achievement, the project that gave him purpose beyond royalty. But with the scandal dominating headlines, sponsors began to feel uneasy. Could they continue to back an event so closely tied to a man humiliated on the world stage? Some sponsors reaffirmed their support, emphasizing that Invictus was bigger than Harry. Others hesitated, wary of the negative press. Reports emerged of private conversations where potential partners questioned whether associating with Harry now carried risk rather than prestige. The possibility of Invictus suffering financially was especially painful, for it threatened not just Harry's reputation but the veterans the games were meant to support. The third ripple touched the monarchy itself. The crown is funded by taxpayers, justified in part by the monarchy's role as a unifying national symbol. Scandals always raise questions about whether that funding is justified, and the DNA revelation amplified those questions. Critics in Parliament argued that the monarchy had failed to maintain the dignity expected of it, and that public money should not fund an institution mired in deceit. Republican movements in Commonwealth countries seized the opportunity to demand independence from the crown, pointing out that an institution unable to guarantee even the legitimacy of its own lineage had no right to hold symbolic authority. The financial implications for the monarchy were not immediate, but the long-term risk was clear. Diminished public support could eventually mean diminished funding. Inheritance questions also fueled the financial fallout. If Archie was not Harry's son, what did that mean for property, trusts, and legacies tied to bloodline? Lawyers began to speculate on whether the children would retain rights to inheritances connected to the royal family. Though the monarchy rarely discusses money publicly, insiders admitted that these questions would eventually have to be addressed. The thought of inheritance disputes being dragged into court was chilling for an institution already struggling to contain one scandal. Yet the possibility could not be dismissed, and financial planners within the palace began quietly preparing for contingencies. The middle of this chapter examines how public donations and charitable projects tied to the Sussexes suffered. Foundations that had once thrived on the couple's celebrity faced renewed scrutiny. Donors questioned whether their money was being used effectively, whether supporting projects tied to Meghan and Harry now carried reputational risk. Nonprofits, sensitive to public perception, hesitated to align themselves with the couple. Meghan's efforts to establish herself as a humanitarian voice, particularly on issues of women's empowerment and child welfare, were undercut by accusations of dishonesty. Even if her projects remained worthwhile, the taint of scandal made them harder to fund and sustain. At the same time, the couple's lifestyle in Montecito came under new examination. Their sprawling mansion, their staff, their security costs, all of it required constant inflows of cash. Commentators began to speculate whether their income streams could sustain such expenses if deals began to dry up. The image of the Sussexes living luxuriously while embroiled in scandal became fodder for tabloids, who suggested that financial collapse could follow reputational collapse. While such predictions were exaggerated, they underscored the fragility of the couple's financial position. Without credibility, their ability to monetize their story diminished sharply. For the monarchy, the financial fallout also extended to tourism and branding. The royal family has long been a global attraction, drawing millions of visitors to Britain each year. Scandals, however, risked tarnishing the monarchy's appeal. If the crown was associated with deceit, illegitimacy, and betrayal, would tourists still flock to its palaces? Would merchandise still sell? Would foreign governments still treat the monarch with reverence? These questions, though speculative, loomed over the institution as it assessed the damage. Financial fallout was not just about numbers. It was about image, and the monarchy's image was its most valuable asset. The ending of this chapter reflects on the interconnection of reputation and finance. For Harry and Meghan, every deal, every project, every opportunity was tied to the story they told the world. The DNA revelation tore holes in that story, and money began to leak out as quickly as trust. For the monarchy, funding and goodwill were tied to the perception of dignity and continuity. The scandal fractured that perception, raising the specter of financial consequences that could outlast the headlines. The financial fallout, then, was not a secondary concern but a central battleground. In a world where monarchy survives as much on public relations as on tradition, betrayal was not just a personal wound. It was an economic earthquake. What happens next was the question that dominated conversations everywhere once the initial shock of the DNA revelation settled. The courtroom had delivered its bombshell. Harry had collapsed. Meghan had maintained her composure, and the palace had begun its frantic damage control. But the world understood that the story was far from over. The immediate fallout was clear: reputational damage, family fractures, and public outrage. The future, however, was uncertain, and uncertainty always invites speculation. Would Harry and Meghan's marriage survive? Would the monarchy take decisive action? Would the children's status change? And perhaps most pressingly, would there be further revelations that deepened the crisis? For Harry, the personal question was whether he could recover from the devastation. His collapse in court had become a symbol of the unbearable weight of betrayal, and experts predicted that his path forward would be long and difficult. Friends of the prince, speaking anonymously to reporters, voiced concerns about his mental health. Some wondered whether he would withdraw from public life altogether, retreating into privacy to recover from humiliation. Others speculated that he might finally break from Meghan, unable to reconcile the love he had once felt with the betrayal revealed in court. The public waited eagerly for his first statement, his first appearance, his first sign of how he intended to respond. Until then, speculation filled the void. For Meghan, the question was survival, of reputation, of credibility, of her role as Harry's wife and as mother to Archie and Lilibet. Would she double down on her defense strategy, portraying herself as victim rather than deceiver? Would she attempt a grand media appearance to reclaim control of the narrative? Or would she retreat into silence, allowing surrogates to fight on her behalf? Her next move was crucial, for it would determine whether she could salvage any credibility with the public. Supporters urged her to stay strong. Detractors demanded her exile, and neutral observers waited to see whether her instincts for narrative control would hold in the face of undeniable scientific fact. For the monarchy, what happens next carried constitutional weight. Titles, succession, and inheritance could not be ignored indefinitely. Would Archie and Lilibet remain in the line of succession, or would they be quietly removed? Would Harry and Meghan keep their titles, or would Charles and his advisors take the unprecedented step of stripping them? Would William step forward to demand clarity, cementing his image as the future protector of the crown? Every option carried risk. Action might appear harsh, but inaction might appear weak. The monarchy had faced crises before, but never one that struck so directly at its most sacred principle, bloodline. The middle of this chapter must dwell on the possibility of legal battles. Some commentators predicted that Harry might seek divorce, and if so, custody of the children would become a bitter and public fight. Would he seek full custody of Lilibet while acknowledging Archie's different paternity? Would Meghan fight back, framing herself as a mother protecting her children from an unsympathetic monarchy? Legal experts speculated that further court cases might follow, dragging the scandal out for months or even years. The possibility of a prolonged legal battle made the world uneasy, for it promised even more revelations, even more humiliation, even more damage to the monarchy's credibility. There were also questions about the public's patience. Scandals capture attention quickly, but they also burn out if not sustained by new developments. Would the public remain engaged with Harry and Meghan, or would they become figures of ridicule, their every move dismissed as scandalous spectacle? Media analysts suggested that the couple might become trapped in their own notoriety, unable to rebuild credibility, yet unable to fade from public attention. For the monarchy, the challenge was different: to absorb the scandal without allowing it to define the entire institution. Would Charles and William succeed in presenting themselves as stable leaders in contrast to Harry's chaos? Or would the revelation poison public perception of all royals, no matter their distance from the scandal? Speculation also turned toward international consequences. In Commonwealth countries, where Republican sentiment was already rising, the scandal was expected to fuel debates about breaking ties with the monarchy. Leaders in Australia, Canada, and the Caribbean faced renewed pressure from citizens who saw the DNA revelation as evidence that the monarchy was no longer a symbol of stability or dignity. The question of what happens next was not confined to the palace. It reached parliaments and political circles across the globe. Could this scandal accelerate the unraveling of the Commonwealth, weakening the monarchy's global influence? The ending of this chapter emphasizes that what happens next is not simply about decisions, but about consequences. Harry must decide whether to remain in his marriage, but either choice, staying or leaving, will reshape his life forever. Meghan must decide whether to fight or retreat, but either path risks deepening the damage. The monarchy must decide whether to act or wait, but either option carries constitutional and reputational risks. The world must decide whether to continue to revere the crown or to see it as an outdated institution undone by its own obsession with bloodline. What happens next, then, is less about prediction and more about inevitability. Every choice carries peril, and every path leads to conflict. The only certainty is that the DNA revelation was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new and even more dangerous chapter in the history of the crown. The circle back to the hook began with a single replay of the moment Harry collapsed in court. Broadcasters used it as the emblem of the scandal, the point where truth struck with such force that the human body could not withstand it. Audiences across the world were reminded that this story began not with legal arguments or palace whispers, but with the raw image of a man undone. The hook was never just the DNA revelation. It was the collapse, the symbol of disbelief, the embodiment of betrayal. To close the narrative, one must return to that moment and ask what it meant, not only for Harry but for the monarchy and the public who watched it unfold. The beginning of this conclusion lingered on the collapse itself. Viewers were asked to remember Harry's pale face, his trembling hands, his body slumping forward as though the truth had drained the very strength from his bones. That collapse was not staged, not controlled, not curated for sympathy. It was involuntary, the body responding to a blow too heavy for the mind to absorb. In that instant, the polished veneer of royalty was stripped away. The prince became a man, the husband became a betrayed partner, the father became a figure of doubt. The collapse was the hook that pulled the world into the story, and it remained the defining image long after headlines shifted. The middle of this reflection turned outward, reminding audiences of the magnitude of the betrayal. The DNA revelation was not simply about one family. It was about tradition, trust, and continuity. The monarchy depends on certainty of lineage, and that certainty had been torn apart. The betrayal was not just Harry's, it was the monarchy's, the public's, even history's. Centuries of ceremony, of carefully documented births and baptisms, of unbroken genealogies, had been called into question by a single test. This was why the hook resonated so deeply. It revealed not only a man's heartbreak, but the fragility of an entire institution. The collapse was a metaphor for monarchy itself, an ancient structure buckling under the weight of modern truth. The circle back also examined the role of Meghan, whose composure in contrast to Harry's collapse became its own form of revelation. To many, her stillness confirmed suspicion. To others, it demonstrated resilience. But either way, it sharpened the drama. The hook worked because it was not just one man falling. It was a couple split in posture and in perception, one undone, the other unmoved. That duality gave the story its emotional power, reminding the public that betrayal is never just about truth revealed, but about how those involved respond to it. Harry fell, Meghan remained seated, and the world judged them both through those images. The end of this section circled fully back to the emotional grip of the story. The hook was designed to seize attention, and in reflecting upon it, the narrative ensured that audiences left with the same intensity they felt at the beginning. The collapse in court was not only a moment of drama, but a mirror for everyone watching. Who among us could endure such a revelation without faltering? Who could remain standing when told that a child we loved was not ours by blood? The circle back was not just about Harry. It was about universal human fear, about the fragility of trust, about the devastating impact of betrayal. To conclude, the story reminded its audience that while the monarchy may be unique, the emotions it exposed were not. The collapse, the hook, was unforgettable because it belonged to all of us, not just to a prince. Reflection and takeaway began with the recognition that what unfolded in that courtroom was larger than a royal scandal. It was a mirror held up to the fragility of trust, the brutality of truth, and the cost of secrets kept too long. The DNA revelation was devastating for Harry, but it resonated because it touched on fears that every human being carries. What happens when the people we trust most betray us? What happens when the identity we believe in is torn away by fact? These questions, raised in the context of royalty, applied to every viewer, every reader, every family. That is why the scandal struck so deeply. It was not just about crowns and titles, but about the universal vulnerability of love and trust. The reflection began with Harry. His collapse in court became a symbol not only of personal devastation, but of the limits of endurance. He had carried grief since childhood, had endured relentless scrutiny, had fought to build a new life. Yet in the end, it was betrayal at the most intimate level that broke him. This was the takeaway for anyone watching. No amount of strength, privilege, or resilience can shield us from the pain of broken trust. Harry was a prince, surrounded by wealth and fame. Yet in that moment he was simply a man brought to his knees by truth. His story reminded the world that pain is the great equalizer. The reflection then turned to Meghan. Whether guilty of deceit or unfairly vilified, her role in the scandal forced the world to confront uncomfortable questions. How much of identity is performance? How much can narrative shape reality before fact intervenes? Meghan's composure in court was interpreted in conflicting ways. Some saw strength, others saw duplicity. The takeaway is that perception is as powerful as truth, especially in the age of media. Meghan may have believed she could control the narrative, but the DNA revelation proved that some truths cannot be spun. The lesson extended beyond her. In a world of curated images and careful words, fact remains the one force that strips masks away. The reflection also lingered on the monarchy itself. For centuries, it had survived by presenting itself as unbroken, dignified, eternal. But the scandal revealed its fragility, its dependence on myths of lineage and continuity. The takeaway for the public was that even the most ancient institutions are vulnerable when confronted with modern truth. DNA does not care about tradition. Science does not bow to ceremony. In this way, the scandal was not just about Harry or Meghan, but about monarchy colliding with modernity. It forced the public to ask whether bloodlines should still matter in an age where identity is more complex, where family can be chosen as much as inherited. The middle of this reflection invited the audience to consider themselves in the story. How would you react if you discovered your child was not truly yours by blood? Would you collapse, as Harry did? Would you stand composed, as Meghan did? Would you fight, deny, or retreat? These questions made the scandal more than a spectacle. They made it a point of empathy, of shared humanity. The takeaway was that betrayal, though devastating, is something we all fear and many experience. The royal scandal was extraordinary in scale, but ordinary in its essence. It was about love, deception, and truth colliding in ways that hurt. The final takeaway was about resilience. Though the scandal tore apart Harry's image, Meghan's credibility, and the monarchy's stability, it also revealed the power of truth to force change. Secrets cannot last forever. Lies eventually collapse under the weight of fact. For those watching, the lesson was clear. No matter how painful truth may be, it is the only foundation strong enough to build a future. Betrayal may destroy trust, but it also clears away illusions. What happens afterward is painful, but it is also necessary. The reflection left the audience with a sobering but powerful message. The truth always rises, and when it does, we must decide whether to break under its weight or to rebuild stronger than before.